Great. Good to see everybody here this morning. Need to keep all those in our prayers that are on the sick list. Holly has had some more issues and gone back to the doctor, and no firm knowledge yet, but changed some medication. Tina is home, slowly recovering after she had been opened up to replace the generator this time, or they call it a generator. So I guess a generator's bigger than a battery, right? Oh, okay. Of course, Brother Terry and Sister Janice and Jesse and the Fullers. Doug is here this morning, but Peggy is not. She is not feeling well. She had told us the other day that her kidneys were starting to fail. So not on dialysis yet, but when it comes time for dialysis, there's no return. So they try to put that off as long as possible. So let's continue to keep her and Doug in our prayers. Our campers got back from camp. Hopefully they hadn't talked to April. She wasn't feeling good the day she got back. Woke up sick, but probably just some little bug. I'm sure it had nothing to do with camp, but yes, ma'am.
Joey Bozeman called me this morning. He died at 12:05. She said today would have been his anniversary. And Jackie's been really sick. And he fell Friday night, and she didn't hear him. She was asleep, but he was bleeding anyway. When you go to the doctor, he's got an appointment.
Another old hard-headed man. If you didn't hear that, Brother Jackie Bozeman wasn't feeling good, and then he fell and wouldn't go to the doctor, but got an appointment for tomorrow. And Joy's father died, 96 years old. He had a long life. Anyone else that we need to keep in our thoughts and prayers? Lisa's back in Minnesota. That's right. Lisa's back in Minnesota. Anyone else?
You already announced Brother Dave is back with us.
I did not mention that Brother Dave's back with us, so it's good to see him back. If there's nothing else, Brother Dave, would you lead us in a prayer then?
Let's pray together. Our most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we thank you so much, Father, for blessing us with another day to come study a portion of you. We thank you, Father, most of all for the hope of salvation of Jesus Christ, sacrifice and not cross. We thank you so much, Father, for all the many benefits that you give to us every day, that you don't help, and the ability to believe and provide all things. We know all good things come through you, Father. Please be with those that we've mentioned here today, Father, that are having health problems, that there's chronic and ongoing problems. Please help those ones and return a portion of them come through you. We thank you, Father, for those you are the Abraham and the other blessed with them. We thank you so much for that, Father. Especially with your blessings and comment. We ask you, Father, please be with us as we study your word today. Please help us understand what the teacher has prepared the lesson that we prepared for us today. Please be with us as listeners so we may apply that lesson to our lives and become better Christians. For it's in Christ's precious name we pray. Amen.
Most of you in here know me and have known me for quite a while. And most of you know that I really do like the Bible, the whole Bible, all of it. And also you know that there are particular things, especially when we get to the Old Testament, that I just really love. And the book of Genesis is one of those, and the section that we're in now, dealing with creation and getting up into Noah and the flood, to me it's a particularly interesting study because of all the people out there in the world, your agnostics, your atheists, your secularists, the evolutionists, all those people come up with all these crazy ideas of what's going on in this part of the book to try to justify the Bible to science or try to rationalize some things out. I even watch programs where when we, starting with chapter 6, where it's talking about the giants and the sons of God coming, marrying the daughters of men. We even get into documentaries even where an alien space race has come down and commingled. And I mean, there are some weird theories out there. But if we look at the first part of chapter 6, we closed it out rapidly Wednesday night, but where it is talking about the sons of God and the daughters of man, if you go back and really think about it logically, the very first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning, God created. Then we went into the 3rd chapter where Adam had called his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. Then if you go to the New Testament where they're instructed that angels don't marry or anything like that, if you put all of that together, it is very simple to understand that when they're talking about the sons of God, that they are talking about the people who look to and try to obey God. They are the righteous. Today, we can be called sons and daughters of God. We're adopted, etc. And throughout the Bible, the people that did worldly things were considered what? People of the world or those of man. So there was that distinction. So there is no mystery here in the first part about the people intermarrying. It was simply the good people marrying the bad people. And of course, the bad people got the good people off track because we get to the point where God now says, I'm going to destroy the whole world except for Noah. When we get to the ark itself, and I'll try to take these in some kind of logical progression. You have people out there who say, scientists who say, that it was impossible for man of that time period to build a ship that big. Well, how long has scientific people been studying the Egyptian pyramids? Over 100 years. Over 100 years, scientists have had their hands on, crawled in, looked at, photographed, x-rayed the pyramid, and to this day, they cannot tell you how they did it. They've got all kinds of theories, and they can't tell you why they did it. So if you can study something for 100 years and say, I still don't know how it was done, how can you logically say that was impossible for something to be done when you can't lay hands on it and see it? So that's one of them. The second one is they say, well, it just was not big enough to do what it says it did. Have you ever thought about how big the ark was? The Bible tells us it was how big? 300 cubits by 30 cubits by 50 cubits. 30, 50, 350, and 30. Now, if you go to people who build ships for a living, those that are trained in building ocean-going vessels, they will tell you that the perfect ratio for a ship is 1:6. If you look at the ark, and we will put it in today's measurements, it was 450 feet long by 75 feet wide by 45 feet tall. Well, what would be a 1:6 ratio in today's language? If you take the 75 feet wide and multiply it by 6, what do you get? 450. It was a 1-to-6 ratio, which is the perfect thing for a sailing vessel today, a cargo carrier. So, also, how do you find square footage of anything? You multiply the length times the width, correct? When you multiply the length times the width of the ark, I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget it. 450 times 75 is 33,750 square feet. That's kind of big, isn't it? However, now we have to multiply that times 3 because there were 3 decks. So now you get 101,250 square feet. Now, what about volume? How would you get volume? Length by breadth by height. 450 times 75 times 45 is over 1.5 million cubic feet. If you want to put that down to logical terms, when I drove a truck, I drove a 53-foot truck that was 8.5 feet wide and 9 feet tall. That's the standard truck in this part of the world. They do have them 60 feet out in California and shorter ones in other places, but about 53 feet is your standard tractor trailer. It would be over 300 tractor trailers worth of stuff. Now, also, if you look down where in verse 14, it says there were rooms, and a lot of people leave that part off. Make thee an ark of gopher wood, rooms shall thou make in the ark, pitch it within and without, and then it goes into the 3 decks and the length, breadth, the height of it. So this, what happens when you build rooms in a house or rooms in any building? It adds strength because you have supporting walls. So every time there is a support, there is added strength. So there's rooms, which would also keep the animals separate and all like that. But it has been estimated by people that are a lot smarter than me and has done the math that a ship that size, now remember also, they didn't have to have an engine room. They didn't have to have a pilot house. They didn't have to have a lot of stuff in it because it was basically built like a barge. It was a hauler. It didn't have, you see a lot of the pictures where it's got the bow on the front. They didn't need a bow either because they're not in a hurry to get anywhere. They're basically just floating around for this time period. It has been estimated that it would hold 120,000 sheep. And why do I even mention that? And that is because a sheep, if you look at the people in the world that figure all this out, the average size of animals would be the size of a sheep. The average size. You're going to have some bigger, some smaller, get into insects and all like that, which we won't touch on. But what they come down to in the end is that they say, this is the ones that have done all the math and everything, that all the animals that they would have taken on the ark would have filled about 1/3 of the ship. They could have had 1 deck for the animals, which would leave 2 decks for people, food, and the rest of the supplies. So there was plenty of room. Then you get into the argument, well, there were only 8 people on board and they have all these animals. How'd they take care of them? Well, this is where you get into maybe some speculation and maybe not, but remember, God had control over this whole affair, right? Animals, and if there's only one window on the ark, and they're mainly in the dark, what is an animal's natural instinct? If they're not nocturnal animals, what do they do at night? All right. Animals also, when food sources are short and water is short, animals have a built-in instinct to go into a period called torpor, T-O-R-P-O-R. Today they call it stasis and a few other goofy names, but basically, without going, and I do not believe they went into hibernation. There are some theories out there that they went into hibernation, but Noah was instructed to bring enough food on board for them and the animals. So that would rule out hibernation. But it does not mean that they didn't go into a period of lethargy where they cut back on what they need to eat and need to do. Like I say, God told us that many people went on board, that many animals went on board, and they stayed there for that period of time. So if you go back to that very first sentence that I mentioned, in the beginning, God created, and you believe that, and you believe that God is in charge, then let's not shortchange God. He was capable of doing whatever he wanted done. Now that's the rough way through that. Does anybody have questions or comments to this point? God was in charge. There's also some out there that say, well, he didn't have time to build the ark. Why not? It has been calculated out that if the four men, Noah and his three sons, worked 6 days a week, rested on the seventh, they could cut, dress, and work and be done in 80 years. How long did they have to do it? 100. Give them plenty of time. Also, they didn't have to deal with bad weather or any other thing going on, right? The next thing is, they said, well, how could they do that and go out to all places on this earth and gather all these animals that they were supposed to gather? Did God instruct them to go out and gather the animals? What did God tell them to do? Build the ark and do what? Put the animals on board. Again, animals have a built-in instinct, and I think it was given to them by God. When there is danger, what do animals do? Can they not sense danger before it gets there? And if God had said, well, all you animals, you go migrate to this point, what's going to happen? They're going to migrate to that point, right? How many animals migrate for thousands and thousands of miles? How do they know where they're going? But they always get there, don't they? And they always get back. And they always seem to take the same path. Have you ever been up in Arkansas or Tennessee during the migration of the Canadian geese? The flyway there? It is a beautiful sight. Andrew and I were up that way one year, December or January. When did Gwen get married? New Year's Eve. So we were on our way back, and we got an early start, and we got to this one place just about daylight, and all I could see was movement. Couldn't quite figure out what that movement was. And we got closer and closer, and I finally figured it out, and we pulled off on the side of the road, and we stayed there for quite a while. I don't know how long. But what was happening, all the Canadian geese had spent the night there, and then this group would blow up and they'd circle and form in their V and fly off, and then a minute later another group would blow up and they'd circle and get in formation and fly off. That was just absolutely amazing to me. how that all worked. But back to the original question, if you get back down to verse 19, it's here's where God, well, start with verse 18. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee, and of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark. Didn't say you had to go out and find them. He's going to bring them into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Now, when we get to the kinds or the species, there are some folks who want to say, well, there was just too many animals out there to do this. And some want to take it back, to me, to a point where I don't believe it should be. Some religious people want to get out of species and go back to kind. Well, there's not kind in taxonomy, but there's kingdoms and phylums and such. But if you, and now this is my opinion, and I want you to know it's my opinion. When you look at the Bible and it says kinds, and they're going to produce after their kind, personally, I believe that kind would equate to species, which is the lowest level in taxonomy. For this reason, if you take a species, you've got a horse and a donkey. Horse is a species, donkey is a species. Mule is a species. But how do you get a mule? Huh? Okay, that takes it back up to the one level, and when you get a mule, they're sterile. Mules don't breed mules. So when you take it up past their particular species, and to me, that is another indication that there's no such thing as microevolution as all these evolutionists want it to be, because God has a built-in safety measure with DNA so that things won't go crazy. Can you imagine how crazy things would be if everything could breed with everything and bring something up? So after its kind, meaning a species, but within the species, there are breeds. It does not mean that there's one of every breed that was taken on board, right? So questions or comments then through this part of it? I've been doing all the talking. Somebody else. 17,600 species. So if you multiply that by 2 of a kind, you get 34,000. Then you got to give in a little extra room for the they were there of those instead of the 2 by 2s. So when you get to the clean, so let's just round it off at 50,000 species, the average size that we were talking about. Also, there's never anything mentioned whether they were full grown or juveniles. And with God doing this, whatever his plan was, it worked. He knew it would work. So, plenty of room, plenty big. Yes, ma'am. That is correct. And they had stalls or rooms for them so to do just a little bit of separating, but everything was vegetarian, so they didn't need to worry about any fights going on. So, yes, ma'am. They could have handled more, but more wasn't receptive. And I sort of bring that along when we get on over into the book and look at Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. Same thing. All they had to do was be obedient to God, and what would have happened? They could have left the city and survived. And it was a large city. It was even bargained, starting out with big numbers and went down. But look how few agreed to it. That basically takes us through chapter 6. Again, is any questions? Or we didn't read it all, but and again, when we get back to all the species and animals and everything, you have to remember that we're only talking about the ones that were dependent on air and land. Your reptiles, alligators, crocodiles, such in the water, any fish, amphibians, you can go through all of that, and it's so that cuts down dramatically. The other thing on that is there's people who say there just wasn't enough water to cover all the mountains. Really? When I was in school, Ray, you was in school about the time I was in school. How much of the earth was made up of water? And now with science and all the modern stuff out there, the satellites and all, they have now come down to an estimate, and I still call it an estimate, but they say 71% of the world is water. All right? Now, anybody know how tall the highest mountain is? It's Mount Everest. You know how tall it is? Wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it. 29,035 feet. That's a tall mountain, isn't it? You know how deep the deepest trench in the ocean is? It's in the Marianas. 36,070 feet. You could lop Mount Everest off, put it in the Mariana Trench, and have how many feet of room to spare? About 6,000 feet of room to spare. They also, again, the scientists that look at these things say that if the earth was perfectly flat, take all the high places, fill all the low places, etc., if it was level, that there would be enough water to be 8,000 feet deep. Also, you have to remember that things, go to 2 Peter 3. 2 Peter 3. Well, my fingers are slow today. I'll get there in a minute. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto the fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. The earth that was perished, the earth that is remains. So pre-flood earth does not mean is exactly the same as it is today, with the same high mountains, low mountains, because we know from historical data that the eruption of a volcano in a heartbeat can change landscape. We saw it at Mount St. Helens. If you've ever heard of Krakatoa, I mean, that was such a massive explosion that the sound traveled all the way around the world. And so we see what happens when there's floods and how quickly a little creek can become and how much erosion there can be. So when we look at what God did and we look at this particular section of the Bible, in my opinion, we just have to remember that God was in charge, and what was then is not what is now. And this is what he did. And he also, I find it very interesting that when we talk about it, when the flood came, it said the water went up 15 cubits. Right? Pardon? 15 cubits above the highest mountain. Right? How tall was how high was the ship? 30 cubits. 15 cubits is half the height of the ship, the ark. Here's the interesting point. A sailing vessel today, a cargo carrying vessel today, draws half its height, meaning that half of a ship is underwater when it is loaded. So if God wanted that ark to be floating around undisturbed until it was time for it to settle down, he had enough water to clear the keel, the draw on the boat. Does that sound like that was things done by happenstance or a plan? Good planning. Brother Cock, you had something to say? Accidental, right. What some would want you to think. Okay. Any questions then on the ark, the animals, anything like that? Okay. I've either got you all confused or most of you agree with me, one of the two. So, starting then with chapter 7. The Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee I have seen righteous before me in this generation. Now, of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and the female, of beasts that are not clean by two, the male and female. So the unclean animals went in 2 by 2, a male and a female, to repopulate. We get into a lot of discussion then with what does it mean by sevens? Because if we go in by twos, a male and a female, does that mean that there were 7 pair of clean? Or does that mean that there were 6 pair of clean and 3 pair of clean and an odd one? I want to give you something to think about. What was the purpose of them going in by pairs at all? Reproduce, repopulate. Now, when Noah came off the ark, what was one of the first things he did? He took one of every clean animal and offered it as a sacrifice. I'm not saying this is what happened, but if you had 3 pair, if you'd had 7 pair go in and one had been taken for a sacrifice, that would have left an odd one, wouldn't it? But if 3 pair went in and there was an odd one for that sacrifice, then they all start out in pairs. Just something for your thought. Not saying that that's how it happened. What we know for a fact happened is more clean went in than unclean. Brother Jeremy. Because when they came off of the ark, now they can be meat eaters. And then there's the distinction between the unclean and clean as far as what they were allowed to eat. Right? God had the plan in place before. Yes, sir. Brother Clarence, do you have your hand going up? Like I say, that's, just most people take it to be that it went in 7 pair of clean and a pair of unclean, and for reasons that were stated, they were to be used for sacrifice. And then when they were given the instructions on what they could and couldn't eat, they could only eat of the clean animal. So that would get them to start then on being the meat eaters. Okay. Of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And Noah did according unto all the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, into the ark because of the waters of the flood, of clean beasts and of beasts that are not clean, and of fowls and of everything that creepeth upon the earth. They went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. This gets back to what I was talking about. The earth that was is not the same today, because here we've got the earth breaking up and waters from the deep coming up and everything starting to change. Verse 13, in the selfsame day entered Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, the sons of Noah, Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them into the ark, they and every beast after his kind. And this is where I'd gone into describing kind as being species, because it's the ones that reproduce after their kind. Because it had just said to keep alive the seed of all of those. And every creeping thing that creepeth, etc. And they went in unto Noah and the ark, 2 of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. And they that went in male and female of flesh, as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. Also notice that door was in the side of the ark. And it would have been so massive that, well, they could have probably rigged up some pulleys and done it, but it said God shut him in. What is the significance of God shut him in? Would have been no leaks. God was taking care of him. A lot of people, me one of them, compare that to baptism today. Water saved those, water saves us. God had a hand in it. Christ has a hand in this. So there's some comparisons there. The flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the water increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted high above the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. Some want to make this to be a regional flood and not a world flood. If you believe the Bible, if you believe that first line that I keep quoting, what does this say? Waters prevailed upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. The whole heaven is not regional or local. And this is what we was talking about. 15 cubits upward did the water prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land died, and every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and creeping things, fowl of heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. So if you draw this down and look at it in a timeline, they're actually going to be on board a year, roughly. Why was it necessary if it rained for 40 days and 40 nights and the water covered the highest of the mountains? Why was it necessary for it to take this long for it to subside? And here we go into just some reasoning and logic and common sense. Why would it need to be a flood for that long? I don't want to be gross, but we need to be factual. Lots and lots of things died, and putrefaction is the word they use, which, like I said, I don't want to be gross, but if it had not lasted that long, if it had gone down immediately, can you imagine the stench? But with it being that long, it also allowed for a lot of the animals and things to sink to the bottom, be covered with the silt, and that's where we get a lot of our fossils from today. And then after the flood, when we get over to chapter 10 and verse 25, talking about in the days of Lamech, the earth was divided. That's where the tectonic plates start moving around, and that's why we have the same type fossil bones on all the continents. So, question, I saw Luke back there counting. I don't know how much time I've got left, but questions or comments then through chapter 7. Yes, sir.
Prove that it's a worldwide flood. Archaeologists and paleontologists and everybody searched the world over, and almost every culture in the world has a story of a great flood.
Right.
So it had to be.
Also, if you have never been to Grant, Alabama, I would suggest you go to Grant, Alabama, which is up near Gunnersville. There's a cave up there called Cathedral Caverns. It's not really much of a cave, but you can do the tour in about an hour, maybe less. But there is a stalagmite. I think it's a tite. Andrea thinks it's a mite from the bottom. I think it's a tite from the top. But one or the other that they call Goliath. And by scientific measurement and their calculated rate of growth, it is older than the earth. Secondarily, in the same chamber or the next chamber, and I can't remember, it's been a long time since I've been up there, there is a shark's tooth embedded in the ceiling of the cave. Now, nobody went there and put it there. It was there. For a shark's tooth to be hanging out of the top of the cave roof there, what had to be at one time? Underwater. And we know that stalagmites and tites don't grow underwater. They need dry land because it's the drip of the water, the evaporation of water, which leaves the deposit that creates the growth. So This is an amazing world. Thank y'all so much for your comments and attention.